Welcome everyone, I'm Tina Panic from the Avon Library. Welcome to tonight's Paleo-Indian webinar. We will be recording this event and making it available on our YouTube channel. At any point during the program, if you have a question, feel free to put it in the chat box or the Q&A. We will get to as many as we can at the end. I'm here with two of my co-sponsors, the Avon Historical Society and the Avon Senior Center. I'm going to toss it to Jen from the Senior Center and she'll toss it to Terry, and then we'll get our lecture started. Jen, it's all yours.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. As the director of the Avon Senior Center, which was the site of the very first public presentation of the Brian Jones discovery in February 2020, I'm happy to announce that we have reopened for small events and will be the site of a, get excited everybody, an Artifact Identification Day on Saturday, June 25th from 1 to 4. If you think you have an item or two that you found that could be Native American, sign up through the library's website and join us that day to find out. Also, I'm pleased to announce that May is Older Americans Month, and it's fitting that we are opening our doors to events like this. But for now, I'm gonna get excited. I'm sure everybody else is too. Looking forward to learning more tonight and about the early people of North America. So I'll turn it over to Terry, who will do the introduction of our presenter. Take it away, Terry.
Thanks, Jen. Good evening. On behalf of the Avon Historical Society, the library, and the Senior Center, including the Planning Committee and partners for our Unearthing History series, I welcome you to the third event, Paleo-Indian Peoples of the Northeast, Survival in the Ice Age and After. If you're new to this multi-year webinar series, we welcome you. We began this education of ancient history due to the discovery in 2019 of the Brian D. Jones 12,500-year-old Paleo-Indian site along the Farmington River here in Avon, Connecticut. To learn more about it, please visit the Avon Historical Society's website and drop down the page of the Brian D. Jones site. Tonight, we welcome Dr. Jonathan Lothrop, the Curator of Archaeology from the New York State Museum in Albany, whose research focus is on how and when Native Americans colonized and then settled in the New York region from near the end of the Pleistocene or Ice Age into the early Holocene era between 11,000 and 8,000 BC. His research is their technology, settlement, and subsistence. He is also an informal consultant on the Brian Jones site analysis. If you've been watching our series since last year, you know that these early people had vast trading routes and networks, so that to have an expert of the people just 100 miles from our site is like having the expert tell us how the early residents of our region lived as the ice receded and the land gave up its riches. All of Dr. Lothrop's degrees are in anthropology from Franklin and Marshall College and Binghamton University. He is frequently on site somewhere involved in a new or ongoing discovery. So we're happy that he took the time out to join us this evening. I turn it over to him now to tell us more about the early residents of this continent.
Well, thank you, Tina and Jen and Terry for that introduction. And I really appreciate the invitation to speak here. I'm going to share my screen now, get this slideshow up and running.
And I put the links in to both the Artifact Day that Jen mentioned and the Avon Historical Paleo-Indian Fact Site FAQs. They're both in the chat for everybody. There we go. Now we can see it.
Okay, so this is, of course, the driving factor of all of this interest is the Brian Jones site that David Leslie has been working on. And I know there were presentations last year, and David will be talking in, I think, October with some updates on his ongoing research. And what I'd like to do is give folks a sort of a more of a background presentation to give you some broader context on where the Brian Jones site fits in when we look at the broader Northeast. So we're extending from the Atlantic coast, New England, New York, and the Great Lakes. So we're going to focus on these first peoples of the Northeast who came into the region in the late Ice Age, shortly after what we believe 13,000 years ago. And the presentation has sort of implicit and explicit questions, including how and when did this migration into the late glacial Northeast happen? How did they survive? How did they make a living on this subarctic landscape with a seasonally very harsh environment? How did they interact with each other across often vast distances? And at the end of the Ice Age, which ended abruptly, what potential effects did that climatic transition have on these early peoples? So here's just a general outline. I'm going to give you some background. I'm going to talk about the peopling of the broader Northeast. I'm going to talk about the lifeways, how these people were making a living, so to speak. And then after the Ice Age, talk about what we call late Paleo-Indians and the archaeological evidence for their experiences in the Northeast. This background, I'll just touch on the Ice Ages, then talk about climate and landscapes and fauna. So background, when we talk about the Ice Ages, we're talking about the geological term, the Pleistocene era, which began 2.6 million years ago. And it was marked by repeated cycles of glacial cold with ice sheet advances and interglacial warmer periods with ice sheet retreat. And there were 12 to 18 of these glacial advances and retreats in North America, including the Northeast. And during the last glaciation, which reached its peak, its maximum extent at 21,000 years ago, the average global temperature was 11 degrees Fahrenheit colder than today. 25% of the Earth's land area was covered with summer ice, and sea level was 400 feet lower. So a fundamentally different world. Causes of ice ages are multiple, but atmospheric composition and cyclical changes in the Earth's orbit around the sun are two of the major factors to keep in mind. And what's happened over the last 30 years or so is that we've been able to develop much more detailed information on Ice Age climates and the end of the Ice Age based on geochemical proxies from Ice Age cores that have been extracted at various places, including the Greenland ice sheet, which is 2 miles thick. And it's got layers in it, and individual layers represent individual years in the Ice Age. And what this research is also telling us is that when you transition from a glacial to an interglacial period, the boundaries between at the boundaries, you can have abrupt climate oscillations in temperature, especially, and that's relevant to what we're going to be talking about in a minute. So near the end of the Ice Age, there was a significant warming trend called the Bowling Alrod, 14,700 to 12,900 years ago. And that's part of this oscillation. It got rapidly very warm, and then right after that, at 12,900 years ago, within a matter of years, a second climatic oscillation called the Younger Dryas, which begins at 12,900 and goes to 11,600. This is the last gasp of the Ice Age, and this is the climate in which these fluted point peoples are living in. And I neglected to say the origin of the name of this period, the Younger Dryas, is a name for a small flower called Dryas octopetala that flourishes on the tundra. And finally, at the end of the Ice Age, marks the start of the Holocene. Temperatures rise abruptly at 11,600 years ago. This is an abrupt climate change that we'll talk about more shortly. So landscapes of the lake glacial Northeast. If you're looking at the region as a whole at 13,000 years ago, the ice had retreated northward. The Laurentide ice sheet was in Canada. The most southern extent of the lake glacial maximum was here, that skirted, expanded beyond New York and went into Ohio and south of Massachusetts. The Atlantic coast was much further out to sea, out on the continental shelf, because the shore sea level was much lower. The Champlain Sea formed because, although the sea level was lower, the landscape had been depressed by ice, the weight of the glacial ice, literally. And so when the ice sheet retreated into Canada, that allowed the Atlantic Ocean to flow in the St. Lawrence Valley and flood this whole area northeast of the Ontario Basin. That's called the Champlain Sea. We'll be talking more about that later. These are the proglacial and late glacial lakes in the eastern Great Lakes at that time. And if we were talking about the environment of the late glacial Northeast, it was characterized as, it can be characterized as a subarctic climate with extreme seasonality. The summers were not that much cooler than today, but the winters were bitterly cold. And so it was a tough environment to live in. And if you sort of took a transect generally from south to north or north to south, in terms of what the landscapes would like at the uppermost areas south of the glacier, you'd see tundra, and then it would grade into spruce parklands, as you see in this photo, and then conifer hardwood forests further south. So what are the animals, the potential prey species that are running around on the landscape at this time in the broader Northeast? Well, we have some details from some colleagues of mine at the New York State Museum had been dating fossils of Pleistocene fauna and then running statistical analyses on it. And what we can say is that caribou, or Rangifer tarandus, which live today in subarctic regions like the Labrador Peninsula, they colonized New York about 17,000 years ago. These were long-range migratory herds that moved seasonally between boreal forests in the south and then moved north of the tree line in the spring to calving areas on the tundra. So migrating sometimes 200, 300, 400 miles in a year one way. There were also mastodon. Mammoth were present as well, but mastodon were far more common, and they appear to have colonized New York and much of the Northeast about 14,000 years ago. They disappeared about 12,500 years ago, and their habitat was spruce parklands and forests. They browsed on spruce trees, and they coexisted with the Paleo-Indian peoples that we're going to be talking about for 3 to 4 centuries. So that's raises important issues. If you think back to the map and the footprint of the Champlain Sea, we know from fossils that have been recovered in sediments of the Champlain Sea that there was an abundant cold water marine fauna of whales, seals, fish, and waterfowls that you can see today on the Labrador coast. And finally, I now want to turn to this process of the actual peopling of the lake glacial Northeast, talk about the routes of entry, models of their migration and demography, and then get into the chronology and the archaeology. So we saw this map a few minutes ago, and we can use it to think about where these people may have come from. And if you've got an ice sheet, obviously across the north and these proglacial lakes, and they're going to be coming from the west and the south. So the vectors of in-migration were probably something like coming into Ohio and Michigan and southern Ontario, up the Ohio Valley, perhaps up the Susquehanna and Delaware valleys, perhaps, as well as perhaps along the continental shelf. That's now submerged, but there's probably lots of Paleo-Indian sites out there that we can't find because they're underwater. But this is another potential vector of migration into the region. These people were descendants of what archaeologists call Clovis populations that are dated from 13,400 to 12,800 years ago, and will give you a more detailed definition of that in a moment, but just talking about the peopling process itself, think about this. They're migrating into a region that is empty of humans. They're the first people to come into the region. And so there's probably some initial exploration and then population movement into the region of the broader population. And if you're doing that, if you're coming into a region that you know nothing about, then there's a process of what archaeologists and geographers call landscape learning, where you've got to come in and you got to figure out the geography, you've got to figure out the environment, the local climate, where the animals are, where they aren't, seasonally available plant foods and those kinds of things, and learn the terrain. This landscape learning process, this concept, there are several researchers who've talked about this, Jim Peterson, Nathaniel Kitchell, who talked earlier in the series. They both thought that the process was pretty quick, maybe a generation, maybe 2 generations, maybe 3 generations, so less than a century. Nathaniel Kitchell has suggested that that process took place so quickly that these sites are archaeologically invisible. We'll never find the first sites of the people exploring this landscape in the late glacial Northeast. And what we do see is thought to be evidence of what people already know about the landscape, and they're actively using it based on their acquired knowledge. How many people was involved? Now, Brian Jones is the only person who's ever actually thought about that in any detail, and he actually developed some demographic models back in 2010, thinking about peopling of the New England region specifically. And his projection, or his assumption, and I think this is pretty legitimate, he projected that maybe 250 individuals initially came into the New England region, not all together. These people were living in small bands that were dispersed across the landscape. So it sort of happened incrementally with small groups who were probably communicating with each other seasonally. At the same time, you might have had the same number of people come into New York and come into Michigan and Ontario. So you're looking at tiny, tiny populations that probably didn't get much bigger during the late Pleistocene. And they're spread over a vast landscape. So it's almost impossible to imagine, but this is the demographic context to think about when these people are migrating into the region. So I said I was going to talk about Clovis. I want to just give you a few more details because we think these are the ancestral peoples to those groups that came into the late glacial Northeast. So Clovis is the oldest widespread archaeological culture in North America. These people did not live on glaciated terrain as the ones that we're talking about today. They lived south of the late glacial maximum. As we said, between about 13,400 and 12,800 years ago. They were hunters of mammoth and other kinds of Ice Age fauna that's been well documented. And their calling cards, of course, were these Clovis fluted points that had very short flutes at their bases, very short channel flake removals. It's called diagonal fluting. They also had very shallow basal concavities on these points. And that's an important feature. Another aspect of their technology is that we're, aside from points, they were making all their other stone tools in their toolkit using conical and wedge-shaped cores to produce blades for tools. And that's a very distinctive feature of their technology. Now, here are images of the oldest fluted points, we believe, in the late glacial Northeast. These points that we call Chris Ellis and a colleague of mine called Clovis-like. We think they date to about 12,800 BP, but that's based on a rationale that I'll explain in a minute. We don't have radiocarbon dates yet on that, but we do have radiocarbon dates on these points called Gainey points, about 12,700 to 12,200. These are all, of course, tips for hunting weaponry. The Clovis-like points have short flutes, like Clovis points. They have shallow basal concavities, and they're made the way Clovis points are made. These Gainey points are often quite large. They all share long, very long flutes and very deep basal concavities. So it's a sort of it's both a technological and perhaps stylistic transition in this earliest part of the Paleo-Indian presence in the late glacial Northeast. And so just to restate, these Clovis-like points are comparable to Clovis points, but the people making these points are not using a blade core technology. They're using a flake core technology. So the blanks that they're making to produce tools, they're not this very specialized blade core technology. So that has dropped out of their technological repertoire, and it separates them from Clovis. So their points are like Clovis, but the rest of their technology has significant differences. So we believe that they're younger than Clovis. The Gainey points, we talked about their features. These have been radiocarbon dated. So we're projecting that these Clovis-like points that you can see across the region date to about 12,800, right after the end of the so-called Clovis era. There are other later fluted point forms that we're showing here: Barnes, Michaud, Neponset, Crowfield, Cormier, Nicholas, and Holcomb. These date to 12,200 to about 11,600. These dates, when I'm giving you these date spans, they're partially supported by radiocarbon dates, but they're not. The chronology still needs a lot more radiocarbon dates, but there's general agreement that this technology of fluted points dies out at the end of the Ice Age. Keep that in mind. What were their other stone tools like? I have to comment here that because of the poor preservation of bone in the acid soils of the late glacial Northeast, we virtually never find any organic tools of these people. They surely had them, but they're just not preserved. So we're left almost exclusively with evidence of their stone tool kit. The most common tool at almost all of these sites are end scrapers, these triangular tool forms that microscopic use-wear analysis indicates that the working edge of these tools, which are hafted in socket halves for leverage, were used for processing animal hides. And if you're living in a subarctic climate, you need warm clothing, especially as winter is approaching. So that's a very critical and specialized tool for preparing clothing as well as preparing hides for other kinds of articles. There are other kinds of tools that are handheld, like these big side scrapers. They just have a single unifacial edge. Sometimes it's convex, sometimes it's concave, used for a variety of tasks as handheld implements. And there are these other tools that I'm just generically calling narrow bit unifaces with narrow working edges. Some of them, like this one and this one, were hafted, we think, because their bottoms taper to allow them to fit in a socket. Others, the bottoms expand, so they're probably handheld. And there's gravers, these very small handheld tools, some not much bigger than a postage stamp, with tiny unifacial points that have been flaked on them. Microscopic use-wear analysis indicates that these were used for incising bone and wood. And then PSSKA, it's not a formal tool. It's when you take a flake or a tool and you place it on a hard object and you wail away on it with a hammerstone or a baton, and it develops this very distinctive crushed edges and abrupt flaking pattern. It may have been used for splitting bone or wood. And then finally, drills that are sometimes made on fluted points. We know that this portable stone tool kit didn't just consist of finished tools, it also consisted of tool blanks. This is the green Pauler cache that Graydon Ballard surface collected with his brother over a number of decades. It's in the upper Susquehanna Valley. And there are some tools in this. They're all made of Pennsylvania jasper. Here's a preform for a fluted point. Here's a tiny, severely reworked and rebased fluted point. A flake stone adds in a side scraper, but by far and away the most common element in this cache are these tool blanks, these big expanding flakes, sometimes parallel flakes, that can be used for making a variety of tools. And this, to me, and to other researchers, is part of the ingenuity of these people, because they probably didn't just want to be carrying around finished tools, because sometimes they might want to be able to take a tool blank and fashion it into an implement for a specific task at hand at the moment. And so it's adding a lot of functional flexibility to the toolkit that they're carrying around on this Ice Age landscape. What do the sites look like? Well, most of them are 1 or 2 or 3 small scatters of stone tools, not much bigger than a big living room or a small house. This is the Pot site in Oswego County, south of Lake Ontario. That area excavated there is about the size of an occupation area that measures about 20 meters north-south and 15 meters or yards east-west. Maybe an open campsite in a warm season. On these sites, preserved cultural features are rare, and when they are present, they're usually small hearths. The Brian D. Jones site that you'll hear more about in October from Dave Leslie is exceptional in the number of hearths that it had preserved, in part because it's never disturbed by plowing or other modern earth moving activities, whereas the Pot site, for example, was plowed like many of these Paleo-Indian sites. And these are interpreted as seasonal hunter-gatherer camps of extended families staying for short periods of time, maybe a few weeks, a few days, a month, and then moving on to their next encampment. These people are on the move a lot, and they're covering a lot of ground. And we'll talk more about that later. So I want to talk briefly now about lifeways in the Ice Age, and 2 topics in particular. We could spend all night, but we're going to focus on 2 topics in particular: subsistence, or literally how they're making a living, and their seasonal mobility and settlement. Features of their lifeway that really distinguish them significantly from all Native American groups that came after them. So Paleo-Indian subsistence in the Ice Age, we would expect, based on historically recorded hunter-gatherers who lived in high latitude settings of the subarctic and the Arctic in the 1700s and the 1800s and even the early 1900s, relied for their sustenance to a very great degree on animal protein, terrestrial or marine mammals or fish. And for many of these groups, caribou was often an important seasonal focus. This is an Innu family in Labrador in 1915. They're wearing caribou skin clothing, and that was a major facet of their lifeway. We don't have a lot of faunal evidence of what these people are hunting. Again, this is because of acidic soils in the Northeast. Animal bone is rarely preserved as food refuse on Paleo-Indian sites. And when it is preserved, it's usually because it was thrown into a fire. The organic elements were burned away, and the mineralogical portions of the bone were calcined and by being burned in the fire, and that helped to preserve them. So we talked about caribou as a potential terrestrial prey species. We talked about the younger dryas conditions, and what that did we think right about the time that Paleo-Indians migrated into the region, and perhaps this is one of the things that attracted them, was it led to much more open subarctic landscapes with more spruce parklands and tundra very far north that were favorable for migratory caribou. That's what they like, this combination of open and closed landscapes that they can alternate between in the winter and the spring and summer. We got just 3 sites with actual caribou bone. We have another 5 sites with cervid bone, which is very likely to be caribou. Sometimes it can't be identified to species level. There's also circumstantial evidence for how these people, one way these people are hunting. So the Vale site in northwestern Maine, a fantastic site that Mike Gramley excavated back in 1980. I was actually a volunteer there. That tells you how old I am. And this site is located in northwestern Maine in the Magalloway Valley. This is normally an impounded lake, but in 1980, the water level was way down. And here's the campsite of these people, and across an ancient relic channel that used to be open, there's a kill site. And we're pretty convinced about this because of the wide range of artifacts found here and the excavations on this side of the channel, typical of a habitation encampment. And then very late in the investigation on this eroded land surface here, we found 11 fluted points. Some of them were broken tips, and they were then refitted to bases that were found on the habitation site. So an amazing discovery that hasn't been replicated yet, but it strongly suggests that these people were hunting herd animals that may have been moving south down the valley. This location was upwind, northwest and upwind of the habitation site. So that's one evidence, circumstantial evidence of them hunting herd animals and very likely caribou. What did caribou do for these people? Well, it was obviously a source of meat, also bone and antler for organic tools and hides for clothing. Again, living in a subarctic environment, you've got to have warm winter clothing. So caribou were almost certainly a key species for these fluted point groups, but it's almost very likely that they couldn't rely on them seasonally throughout the year. They relied on them seasons or portions of seasons of the year because they're migratory. One day they're there, the next they're gone. And it's not impossible, but difficult to follow them. These people may have been moving strategically to places to intercept them. But the other thing to know about caribou is that their biology indicates that they go through these boom and bust cycles where a herd grows to spectacular numbers, and then there's a population crash and they dwindle down to only a few percentage points of what the herd size was. So that was something that these people had to contend with in the Ice Age. So they couldn't rely exclusively or primarily on caribou, but it was clearly important to them. Other kinds of fauna whose bones have been found in the glaciated Northeast, the Eudora site in Ontario, bones of Arctic fox and snowshoe hare, obviously animals that live in open Arctic, subarctic environments, and then beaver from the Bullbrook site in Massachusetts. We talked about Mastodon before. They coexisted with early Paleo-Indians in New York and much of the Northeast for a good 3 to 4 centuries, so they certainly knew about them. They saw their tracks on the landscape. They were unmistakable. But did they actually hunt them in, as one might imagine in this dramatized artist conception? There are very high densities of mastodon fossils in certain parts of New York and Michigan, so this is was not an uncommon species during the late Ice Age, but they do disappear from New York and probably most of the broader Northeast around 12,500 years ago, give or take a century. And so the question is, were they hunted and therefore were humans contributing? Were Paleo-Indians contributing to their local extirpation and ultimate extinction? Well, the fact is that in terms of the archaeology that we currently know about, the archaeological sites that we currently know about, there's no evidence of what we might call a kill site. There is one site, the Hiscox site in Western New York, where there's an actual association, an archaeological association of early fluted points, these Clovis-like points, and Ice Age fauna, including mastodon and caribou. This is a paleontological death site at a Ice Age salt spring. Animals were attracted to it. Some of them died there. It's also an archaeological site because of the fluted points that have been recovered there. But there's not evidence of people actually living there. It's not like a habitation site where they're using and throwing away a lot of worn out and broken tools and resharpening them and leaving flakes behind. That wasn't really found there. And microscopic analysis of these fluted points, the ones that have been modified very strangely here with these indentations, they flaked these notches in here and then modified the distal end of this one. The microscopic use wear analysis of those points by John Tomenchuk indicated use wear polish from contact with bone and hide, suggesting caribou. Excuse me, suggesting butchering. Were they butchering mastodon? I really doubt it with these tools because mastodon hide is several inches thick. They might have been butchering caribou. So the prevailing interpretation by the primary investigator, Dick Laub, the former paleontology curator of the Buffalo Museum of Science, is the Paleo-Indians were scavenging dead or dying animals. They knew about this place and may have been scavenging them for hide or meat or bone or ivory. What about the Champlain Sea? We talked about the cold water marine fauna. We have no direct archaeological evidence. However, our colleague Jess Robinson at the Vermont Historic Preservation Office has mapped fluted point locations. You can see here with this symbol in this section and elsewhere in Western Vermont, which was the eastern shore of the Champlain Sea across the water from New York. And Jess Robinson has suggested that these sites that are so close to the modern and ancient shorelines, modern shoreline of the Champlain, Lake Champlain, and the ancient shoreline of the Champlain Sea suggests perhaps the exploitation of marine resources. And this is an interesting idea. And if you recall that the continental shelf off New England is now submerged, perhaps this is an analog for what's going on along Atlantic settings of the Northeast. Was there plant use in the Ice Age? There's limited evidence of it at the Michaud and Hedden sites in Maine, and then the Brian Jones site in Connecticut. David Leslie has recovered very significant evidence of collected plant use. And I'm not going to steal his thunder. He can tell you more about that and when he gives his talk in October. But the collective evidence is that, yes, Paleo-Indians were using plants, but it was probably on a very opportunistic basis. Berries, seeds, that kind of thing. And so it may not have been a major source of sustenance for them. So I want to talk briefly about Paleo-Indian mobility and settlement in the Ice Age. And archaeologists have remarked many times in the past about the locations of fluted point assemblages and the apparent sources of toolstone on which the artifacts are made that are found at those sites, sometimes up to 300 miles distant from the geologic sources where it's believed the toolstone came from. So the notion of trade has been discussed, but largely not supported or not considered to be well supported by archaeologists, because these people are all living in an Ice Age environment. And it's really, if they were trading for toolstone, then you're literally placing yourself at risk of running out of toolstone and being able to produce those tools for survival that you need to live on that Ice Age landscape. It's probably a much safer bet to collect that toolstone yourself from the quarry source and then move across the landscape with it after you've manufactured your toolkit and your blanks. So this most likely indicates a pattern of seasonal movement between a toolstone quarry source and a site destination. I want to sort of talk about that in terms of, first of all, why would they be moving so extensively across these subarctic landscapes? Well, part of it may have had to do with sustenance, seasonal availability of food resources. They're trying to intercept caribou herds at different strategic locations on the landscape in all likelihood, but there may have been social reasons as well. Because if you think about it, if you got maybe 250 people in New York and 250 people in New England, and they're all scattered across the landscape, well, you're not going to marry your sister or first cousin. You're going to select a marriage partner. The other thing you might be doing as a reason to come together with all smaller bands seasonally is exchange information. Where have you had hunting success? What's been going on there? And finally, the subarctic environments of North America have been historically documented as places where native indigenous populations periodically face starvation because of the extreme variability in the seasonal availability of food resources, mammals, fish, and so forth. And so maintaining alliances in situations like that is a way to mitigate risk and maybe save your life on a subarctic landscape by keeping in touch with people that live maybe 100 miles away or 50 miles away. This coming together of Paleo-Indians, archaeologists talk about aggregation sites. And it actually, we do have evidence at some sites of Paleo-Indian peoples coming together for seasonal meetings of small bands. And perhaps the best and maybe even the most extreme example is the Bullbrook site in eastern Massachusetts. You see a site map here and you see maps of the Paleo-Indian artifact types that have been recovered there. There are 36 artifact concentrations. This has not been recorded anywhere else in North America. And these artifact concentrations, they're a couple of meters, a few meters across, are interpreted as tent encampments, and they're in a ring arrangement with a central, more empty area. And it's just really stunning. The assemblage, the site was excavated by avocational archaeologists who deserve tremendous credit, because without them, we wouldn't know about the site. The artifact tool stone comes from multiple geologic sources, from northern Maine, northern New Hampshire, New York, Pennsylvania, and this strongly suggests a series of bands all coming together at a seasonal aggregation camp. The last thing I want to do in talking about these fluted point peoples that lived in the Ice Age is how they were moving around the landscape. They're sort of plans of settlement movement. And we can do that by looking just at one type of tool stone that they use commonly, and that's Norman scale chert. It outcrops in the Hudson Valley. It's often green to black. Occasionally it's red. Tends to be rather distinctive. It's also got these characteristic microfossils, these little specks in this biface called radiolaria. And one of the most heavily used, apparently, sources of Norman scale chert was the West Athens hillside. It's both a quarry site where Paleo-Indians mined Norman scale chert to fashion tools. They also lived there. They camped there. This is found in the mid-Hudson Valley. And when we did this research back in about 6 years ago, there was Norman scale chert reported, guessed to be present based on the characteristics of the tool stone at 48 Paleo-Indian sites in the Northeast. And so we wanted to test this idea. We used X-ray fluorescence, a technique for geochemically characterizing artifact tool stone and comparing it to geological source stone tool stone. And we did this for 18 fluted point sites. Then we coupled that with GIS, or geographic information system mapping, to identify possible routes of movement between the source, West Athens Hill, and the site where this chert was found. And so that XRF analysis indicated that 37 of the 47 artifacts we analyzed from 18 sites could be linked to 15 of the 18 sites to West Athens Hill. And then we conducted this GIS analysis using what's called least cost path analysis to delineate possible pathways from West Athens Hill to a handful of these sites that were linked to the West Athens Hill source, because people didn't move in straight lines, obviously. And what that analysis showed is that you can see here these red and purple lines. The red lines are the easiest routes, the least slope to a destination. So from West Athens Hill to Bullbrook. The purple lines are quicker routes, a little more up and down, but faster, shorter travel. So it's a way to model. We'll never know for sure how these people actually moved across the landscapes, but it's a way to help us to think about that. And what was encouraging to us is that when we did this analysis, what we found is that for almost all, not all, but almost all of these pathways, whether the ones that were easier or the ones that were faster, there were other fluted points, sites on those pathways or very close to them within a few miles. And that suggests that there's some viability or validity to these GIS-based pathway models. So it's a way to envision how these people are moving these incredibly long distances over these landscapes. And when you're looking at a pathway down to the Chesapeake Basin, it's probably not the same people who were traveling north to the Vail site in northwestern Maine. These are different groups that are coming to the West Athens Hill site in different seasons at different times over several centuries. So what happens when the Ice Age ends? We're in the Holocene, which most scientists think is just an interglacial that we're extending with climate change. But that climate change takes place very abruptly. And we'll talk about that in a moment. We'll talk about landscapes and fauna, and we'll talk about late Paleoindian chronology and technology. So we've seen this before. And at the end of the Ice Age, within a matter of years, less than 25 years, maybe less than 10 years, temperatures rise abruptly over much of the globe, including most of the glaciated Northeast. This is a climate change that's occurring on a scale that we're all witnessing today. And these people surely witnessed it. And what did that lead to? Well, that warmer and actually much drier climate led to closed pine and hardwood forests across the entire glaciated Northeast. And modern terrestrial fauna. This was not an environment that caribou could easily live in, so it was probably dominated by a larger fauna, were probably dominated by moose and deer. Now, our chronology of these late Paleo-Indian peoples is very poorly constrained, but it's slowly getting better. We don't have many dates, but Jess Robinson of the Vermont Historic Preservation Office has been analyzing and comparing the radiocarbon dates for fluted point groups across the Northeast and for late Paleo-Indian sites across the Northeast, sites that produce points like Agate Basin, Hilo, St. Anne Varney, and what it shows to him, and I think he has a pretty convincing argument that's going to be published shortly, there's a hiatus of several centuries. It could be sampling error, but there's evidence that perhaps the late glacial Northeast is abandoned at the end of the Ice Age, and that these late Paleo-Indian peoples show up later because there's actually chronological overlap with other groups that archaeologists call early archaic that have a very different technology. These late Paleo-Indian fluted biface forms, especially Agate Basin and St. Anne Varney, they have collateral or parallel flaking. They're very similar in their way they're made to late Paleo-Indian groups in the northern high plains. And most archaeologists now believe that this is evidence of a population, a second in-migration of early Holocene Native Americans from the western high plains, moving through the northern Great Lakes region and ending up ultimately in the New England-Maritimes and New York. So a second migration of early Native Americans. What's their technology like? Well, it's this most striking difference is end scrapers that were so common before are now rare or absent and far less standardized. And so we looked at how we compared how fluted point assemblages compared to late Paleo-Indian assemblages during the Ice Age versus after the Ice Age. And there's some directional changes through time in their toolkits. You can just look at ratios. And so in these fluted point toolkits, unifaces, these end scrapers, these end scrapers and these handheld side scrapers, they're very common. They outnumber fluted points and bifaces preforms by an average of 4 to 1, more or less. Very, very striking. And then when you get into these late Paleo-Indian toolkits, as we talked about, end scrapers are rare. They're less standardized. This is a very large, clunky end scraper, and the composition of the toolkit of these late Paleo-Indian peoples is fundamentally different. The uniface to biface ratio is 1:5. The script has been flipped. And so these are fundamental differences in toolkits that coincide with, for late Paleo-Indians, with decreased mobility. They're not moving as extensively across the landscape, and they're surely shifting their subsistence repertoire from migratory caribou to local terrestrial, riverine, and marine fauna. So just to kind of wrap this idea up, these toolkits of early middle Paleo-Indian fluted point groups, very standardized tools and tool blanks, especially end scrapers that were so common, facilitated intensive fall processing of caribou hides. Late Paleo-Indian stone toolkits, there's evidence of reduced mobility. They're not moving around as much, and a decline in the seasonal focus on migratory caribou using Holocene fauna. And perhaps that leads to a reduced importance of formal hafted tools for processing. We can't rule out the possibility that they're simply using organic tools for some of the processing tasks that were used previously for end scrapers, but we have no evidence of that. So we've got a significant preservation bias there. So that's some vignettes of early, middle, and late Paleo-Indian across the late glaciated Northeast. I hope that gives you some context for hearing more in the future, especially from David Leslie about this, the wonderful Brian Jones site in Connecticut, which just consists of some really spectacular discoveries that are a credit to him and his team in the work on the site, and the insights that it's progressively leading to as they've been working on the analysis. And I'd be happy to answer questions from anyone who might be wondering about some aspect of what I've talked about, or maybe some things that I didn't talk about.
Well, thank you. That was wonderfully thorough and answered a lot of the questions that we've been forming throughout this series. And we do absolutely have questions from the audience already. And one from the early beginning of your slides: what prompted the early migration north?
Well, that's a $67,000 question. And archaeologists, for a long time, archaeologists just couldn't deal with migration of populations. They just didn't want to talk about it because they didn't have enough evidence. They didn't know how to interpret it. That started to change in the 90s, where they really started to focus on it and think about working with geographers and sort of thinking about modern migrations. And there's always there's what they call push-pull factors, reasons they might want to leave where they are, or reasons why they might be attracted to a new region. Some of those factors are social. I think in the case of the earliest Paleo-Indians that migrated, these descendants of Clovis groups that migrated into the late glacial Northeast, what may have happened is that this came right on the cusp of the Younger Dryas abrupt climate episode, where it suddenly becomes much colder, and that landscape of the Northeast responds very quickly in less than a century. Hardwoods don't disappear, but they become much less common. They're only found in the southern part of the region. Other tree species that live in more open landscapes become much more common, and it's a very dramatic shift. And it likely, that change in the landscape led to fundamental changes in the animals that were living there, especially caribou. And they may have discovered that these descendants of people who lived south of the late glacial maximum in unglaciated terrain, they may have discovered through exploration that in the glaciated Northeast, there are migratory caribou there that could have been a major attraction. Paige Newby, Art Spies, Jim Bradley, Dick Bovair, and others have talked about this in the last 10 to 15 years. And I think it's a pretty compelling scenario as perhaps the primary reason, or perhaps just one of the reasons that these early peoples decided they wanted to move into this previously uninhabited region.
Okay, I'm going to try to stick with the migration-esque questions first, and then we'll move into some of the other ones. If you are carrying tool stones 300 miles and carrying enough to use for a season or two, what are you carrying them in?
Good question.
Okay.
We'll never know for sure, but if you look at evidence of recent evidence of hunter-gatherers in Arctic and subarctic settings, they're using animal hide for all sorts of things other than clothing. You can use animal hide for tents. You can use animal hides. You can fashion containers or receptacles for carrying items that you use, such as your stone tool kit or other kinds of organic tools. And these can be attached to straps, hide straps, or the equivalent of backpacks. We don't know exactly what they were doing in that regard, but surely these people who moved so much and carried most of what they owned on their backs, when you think about it, it's just incredible, because they're walking 100, 200, sometimes 300 miles in a year or more. They've got to have had a technology made of hide and perhaps basketry as well that doesn't survive in the archaeological record, that they could carry things in. And there's actually sort of indirect evidence of this in some Paleo-Indian caches that have been found north and south of the last glacial maximum. And sometimes you look at the tools and it looks like there's sheen. There's a very bright polish at the flake arises, where two flakes intersected that creates a ridge, and it looks like this has been interpreted as bagware, where you've got 10 or 20 or 30 tools all laid together in a hide bag. And as you're traveling 10, 20, 30, 40 miles in a day or two or three, those things are rubbing against each other and creating that hide polish. It's been experimentally reproduced. And so that is seemingly indirect evidence that they're carrying their stone tools in some kind of bag or backpack or something to help them carry them across the landscape.
Okay, and you did hit on this in your answer. During the migratory phase, how far would a family group travel in 1 year? And you said 100, 200, 300 miles.
Yeah.
A companion question to that is, what percentage, if you're breaking down the percentage of the day, what percentage is just finding the food to exist and subsist versus travel? Is it 50-50? Is it 30-70? Does it depend on the weather?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's something we'll never know, but when you look at the historic records of subarctic hunter-gatherers who pick up and move, they travel to a new destination. They're pretty mobile too. Most of them not as much as fluted point groups, but a few are. And they'll pick up and move. Sometimes they'll send somebody out in advance, and other times the whole family will pick up and move. And they'll travel to that destination. It might be a pretty significant distance. So they're probably spending several days traveling to a new campsite location, spending more time probably, or perhaps, at that location, hunting and doing things that you need to do when you're not hunting, repairing broken weaponry, repairing other articles in their technological repertoire of organic and hide and technology. And then for whatever reason, perhaps because they decide they want to try and intercept game at a new location, or they're going to go to this location where they know there's lots of berries, they'll pick up and move again. So they're probably spending most of their time at a campsite, and shorter periods when they're moving across this landscape, sometimes for pretty extensive distances. And so the other thing to think about is they're not always using just one toolstone source. Often they're it looks like they may be cycling between one or two or maybe even more toolstone sources over the course of a year, and that as you move through that cycle of movement, you get some new toolstone, and it's gradually depleted and starts to run out hopefully before you get to the next toolstone source.
Okay. All right. It seemed, like I said, I'm going to stick with the migration geography stuff and then we'll move to the other ones. It seemed there was a center point near Albany on the map that you had shown, and then everything sort of had spokes coming out from there. Is there any reason why that was the centralized point?
Well, that may give you the wrong impression. What we were doing in that study of the coupling of a geologic sourcing effort with then the GIS mapping effort of projecting the pathways that people may have taken after they stocked up on their toolstone at the West Athens Hill site. The thing to keep in mind is there are multiple toolstone sources distributed every 50, 75, 100 miles across much of the Northeast. And so that's one part of one season, perhaps a segment of a season of movement when they visited that West Athens Hill toolstone source, and then they went somewhere else, maybe 100, 200, 250 miles away. But they're also at other times of the year probably exploiting other toolstone sources. So there's a cycle of movement there, and the graph can give you the impression that they're just sort of moving out, it's like spokes and coming back, and it's actually probably a cycle, a geographic cycle of movement that may have been not circular, but have segments all across the landscape, and that over the course of the year, they're visiting West Athens Hill maybe once and then moving on and not coming back there until the next year, perhaps.
Okay. What evidence of berries in food? What evidence of berries are there in the food remains, and have any hearths been found in New York and New England?
That's a great question. There are two sites, the Michaud site and the Hedden site in Maine, where they found recovered carbonized berry seeds. And I believe that David Leslie has some pretty significant evidence of that at the Brian D. Jones site. But I'm not gonna.
No, I love that you're doing a trailer for his fall lecture. We appreciate that.
Yeah,
that's fantastic.
I'm advertising for Dave. I'm going to let him get into that in more detail, but it's the other problem is that, as I said, these hearths are rarely preserved at these sites, and we have no Paleo-Indian hearths preserved at Paleo-Indian sites in New York. They've been found at other sites around the region, in Ontario, in parts of New England and the Canadian Maritimes.
Okay. Segues perfectly into the next question. Was the technology used by Paleo-Indians at all similar to that used by early Europeans of the same time?
Oh, so upper Paleolithic groups in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, there are some similarities. There are no fluted points, but there are tools like those objects that are called narrow end scrapers, the variety of that's hafted. The archaeologist Mike Gramley found lots of those at the Vale site. He named them Lamas, which is a upper Paleolithic tool type. It's called a Lamas because it's shaped like a slug. So there are a couple of parallels, but not many.
Okay. Has any type of art been, wait, let me say this again. Were any types of art developed, and have they been found, or were these groups too busy trying to stay alive and not necessarily creating something cultural?
Yeah, it's a great question. And surely they had their art. There's no evidence of that as far as I know, unless I'm having a memory lapse. I don't believe there's any evidence of that in the Northeast. But there is evidence of potential art at, for example, the Clovis occupation of the Galt site down in Texas. Ashley Lemke has studied that. And so there's that's been published on. It's abstract incising on rocks, as I recall. So it's limited evidence, but it seems to be there.
But maybe not art, but in that same cultural thing, we do know that David Leslie found one piece that he's going to explain further for us later, with a
Mhm.
drilled hole that he thinks might have been, hung as an amulet or something like that.
Yep.
And I think I've heard of other sites like that who have had those, that there could have been something adorning that was worn. So.
Yeah. As just a postscript, I did misspeak, because at the West Athens Hill site, there was a small flat cobble that was found with a ladder design incised on it.
Oh,
And unfortunately, I've never photographed it. It's in the monograph that Bob Funk wrote. So that's a possible indicator of, or example of, art by these fluted point groups in the Northeast.
Okay. Our next question, it partially could be answered by the lecture that we had last month, and I think David Leslie may address some of this also in the fall, but I like that the questions overlap throughout our series. Is there any evidence of mastodons and humans in Connecticut, Vermont, or Massachusetts?
Again, we know that they overlapped for a few centuries, maybe 4 centuries. The only site that I'm aware of where mastodon remains and Paleo-Indian artifacts have been found together at the same locality, as far as I know, it's the Hiscox site in Western New York. And we talked about that to some extent. So
was that the one where the rib was laying there and then a
Yeah.
couple of points between it? Because
Yep.
in our last, the last webinar we had, they showed that photo.
no, that's I think that's the Folsom site
Oh, okay.
out in New Mexico. So
Oh.
there are mastodon remains found at the Hiscox site, tusks, ribs, etc., all kinds of elements, but there's no sort of fluted point sticking in a rib at the Hiscox site or anywhere else, as far as I know. So the search continues.
Right.
And then we're just going to circle back to hearth for this question. Was there a hearth uncovered and dated by Dr. William A. Ritchie at what he called the Bannerman site along the Hudson River?
That's a good question. My impression of the Bannerman site, this is a multi-component site that Bill Ritchie excavated, I believe, in the 1950s. And my impression from that, I would need to double check that, but my impression is that there's no evidence of Paleo-Indian material at the Bannerman site. The occupations were later. And I don't think that, I know he uncovered some hearth features there, but I don't think he had any Ice Age dates on hearth features.
And then I just always like to ask, in conclusion, we've gotten through the audience questions. Is there anything you want to make sure our audience takes away from your lecture or about this time period with this group of people that we should make sure we keep in mind?
That's a good question. Well, as we keep noting, you're going to be hearing more from Dave Leslie about the Brian D. Jones site in October. This is context for that, and you might have the impression that we know a lot about these Paleo-Indian peoples based on this presentation, but there's still so many questions. The more questions you ask, the less you know. So this research really began in New York State in the 1950s with Bill Ritchie. He was the first person to systematically look at evidence for Paleo-Indian peoples, and it didn't start much earlier anywhere else in the Northeast. So, this has only been going on for about 60 or 70 years, and we're just, kind of scratching the surface. I think there's important finds to be made that will shed more light than we can imagine in the future. And I think the Brian Jones site is one example of that.
Yeah. Can I ask one last question? You
Certainly.
said that Brian Jones developed a model in 2010 on how many people were in these various groups or how many people could have been. Is anybody else carrying that work on?
No,
He has passed.
Brian Jones is the only person who has modeled population for the Lake Glacial Northeast. And it was really an important paper that doesn't get the attention it deserves, but at some level, you have to think about the demography of these people. And that's his paper I think is a really effective tool for doing that, because it's, you know, almost impossible for us to imagine so few people on such a vast landscape, and yet they were doing that and surviving for over 1,000 years in that subarctic climate. So it's I think it's a very instructive paper and useful context for us.
More investigation done on that too.
Certainly. This is he was, you know, he's constructing these mathematical models and making assumptions of population growth. Other people have done that on a hemispheric scale, looking at the process of colonization from Beringia through North America and into the South, with certain assumptions about reproductive rates and so forth. So it could be done. It could be pursued further for the late glacial Northeast, certainly.
Fantastic.
Wow. Great.
Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us and our audience this evening. You're absolutely welcome back, because I have a feeling this series is just going to keep igniting new topics for us to cover. Terry, any last word just before we sign off tonight?
Nope, just want to remind everybody that on June 25th, we're having the Artifact Identification Day at the Avon Senior Center. Please bring your items, but you need to register through the Avon Library website, because they're going to be in time slots that everybody's going to get. The Institute for American Indian Studies in Washington, Connecticut are going to be doing the identification, and we just hope that a lot of good things are found. If we all remember Ken Fader's presentation a year ago right now, I think he was our May presenter. He said, people all over this Farmington Valley have found all sorts of things, bring it all in. And so this is the time to do that. So we really appreciate this, Dr. Lothrop, and I've taken probably 10 pages of notes, because this has just given me so much more to think about now. And I wish I had time to get into the modeling of how many people were here to carry on Brian's work, because I think that's a really important question. And we're fascinated with how these people live. So thank you very much for everything.
All right.
You are most welcome. Thank you for having me.
All right, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you soon. Bye.